Hi all, it's Teresa in Gemma's house. Well, I'm going to make a new quilt, and I love patchwork quilts, so that's what I'm going to make. And I've been admiring all these quilts I see on this Facebook quilting group that I'm in, and they're all just squares. There's no sashing or borders or anything else, just squares. So I've made other quilts in the past that have patchwork elements in them, but it seems that patchwork quilts are so interesting in that they can all turn out so different looking. So for this patchwork quilt, I want to use 2-inch squares. The finished size would be 2 inches. So I'm cutting them to be 2.5 inches because when I sew them all together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, they'll be 2-inch finished size. So whether you're just starting to quilt, you might find some helpful tips in this video when you're preparing to make your quilts. Or if you're a more experienced quilter, maybe you'll just like to watch to see what other quilters do to prepare for and make their quilts. Okay, so the way I figured out how many squares I need for this quilt, I measured one of my existing quilts that fits my mattress really well, and it's 94 by 94 inches. So I'm going to make this quilt 2 inches larger on each dimension, so 96 by 96 inches. So I decided I want a border on this quilt because I just like the look of that. So I'm going to make the border 4 inches. So if I subtract the width of the borders from the entire width, that would be 96 inches minus 8 inches for both of the borders. That would equal 88 inches. So 88 inches is the size of this area where all the squares will be. So my squares are 2 inches, the finished size, and all of my dimensions here are the finished sizes. So I'm going to take 88 inches divided by the 2 inches that each square is, and that gives me 44 squares. So I need 44 squares across and 44 squares down to cover this area of the quilt. So the math on that, of course, would be 44 squares across by 44 squares down, and that equals 1,936 squares that I need to fill this area. So what I'm going to do to make it more manageable on the sewing machine, I'm going to sew 11 squares in a strip. So that would be 11 times 2 inches. That equals a 22-inch long strip. And then I'm just going to keep sewing more and more strips, and I'll sew 11 strips together, and that will give me a larger block that is 22 inches by 22 inches. 11 squares across and 11 squares down. And I'll have to keep making this size block, and then I'll sew 4 blocks across and 4 of those blocks down to fill in this area of 88 inches by 88 inches. So of course you would have to figure out the math for your particular quilt according to the size of quilt you want and the size of the squares that you want too. But this is just an example that could maybe help you to figure out the math on your quilt. And if you have any questions about this math, just leave a comment and I'll be sure to respond back to you. Okay, so now on to my tips that I want to show you of how I'm starting to prepare for this patchwork quilt. This is my sewing room currently, and I have plans to add another big table in here. I just bought a table at a thrift store for $2, and it has a nice wood base and a 3-foot by 5-foot top. So I'm going to use that as a sewing table and cutting table, and I'll just put it lengthwise right beside my artist drafting table that I also use for sewing purposes. I'm starting out by ironing all of the pieces of fabric that I plan on cutting, and I iron them with a nice hot steam iron on both sides. And some of these longer pieces, I made sure to line up any straight edges that I could find on the fabric, and I'll start cutting from that straight edge. So I try not to waste any of the fabric. So I ended up folding this fabric over twice, and I'll be cutting through 8 layers of fabric here. So I made sure to have a nice sharp rotary blade. And I lined it up on the one side and am measuring my 2.5 inches from that left side. I already had it lined up on that bottom, so I just turned my cutting board and am measuring the 2.5 inches from that side that I had lined up on the cutting board line. Some of these fabrics, like this one, I have it folded over once, and I'm starting to measure my 2.5 inches from the cut edges of the fabric and moving over towards the folded edge of the fabric. That way, I ended up having a piece on the folded edge of the fabric that was wide enough for me to iron flat, and then I was able to cut one more strip from it. So I'm always trying to cut the fabric so I don't waste any fabric. And again, I already have it lined up on the bottom, and I just turn my cutting board and start measuring over from that edge that I had lined up on the line of the cutting board. And this is speeded up 4 times, so I don't cut that fast. I'm very careful when I'm using this rotary cutter. So I'm counting these squares as I'm stacking them, and I always keep a running total of the squares that I have cut when I put them in my little container here. It's much easier to keep a running total as you cut the squares, because I really don't want to be counting all of these squares when I have them all cut. And I need 1,936 squares. If you're doing a sewing project, and if you have a pet, just a reminder, you have to remember to feed your pet, because these quilt projects can be addicting, right? So I still need about 750 more squares, so I'm looking over all the squares I have cut so far to see the color combinations that I have. And it looks like I have predominantly blues and oranges, with some variations in the color shades of blues and oranges, reds, and I do have some solid colors in here that are leaning towards light beiges. So I looked through my other fabrics, and I decided that I would keep the blues and the oranges as the predominant colors. So I have these other fabrics that I'll cut to get the rest of the squares that I need. So I hope you found some interesting tips in this video. So in the next video, I'll be sewing this patchwork quilt together. And can I ask you to please check out my main Gemma's House channel page, because you might find some other videos on there that you are interested in watching as well. And if you like this video, can I ask you to please give it a thumbs up? That really helps my channel. So thanks again for watching. I really do appreciate it. Bye-bye.